Hello, my name is Katrina,
And I'm Cindy.
and we'll be walking you through the study done by Harrison and Tong called Decoding Reveals the Contents of the Visual Working Memory in Early Visual Areas.
So let's get started.
Think about all the things that you see every day, everything that passes you by, everything that you pay attention to, and even the things that you don't. What do you remember? You may notice that you can remember quite a bit, but how? When we really look into it, we know that the higher order areas lack the visual selectivity that early sensory areas have. So how is it that we can remember specific visual features so well over time? This is the question that Harrison and Tong sought to answer with their research. So let's dive in.
In their research, Harrison and Tong had 3 objectives, and their goal was to answer these 3 main questions. First, does activity in early visual areas reflect the contents of working memory? Second, how do orientation selective responses for remembered gradings compare with the stimulus-driven activity elicited by direct viewing of actual gradings? Or, in other words, is there a difference between seeing and thinking about the orientation of a grading? Lastly, is orientation selective activity maintained throughout the working memory delay period?
To answer such questions, they did 3 different experiments respective to each question. Their experiments consisted of 6 observers from the ages of 24 to 36 who had normal or corrected to normal vision. Scanning was done using a 3 Tesla fMRI scanner, and all participants used a bite bar system in order to minimize head motion. The first experiment that they did was the working memory experiment. In this experiment, participants were asked to maintain fixation while 2 sample orientation gradings were randomly presented. They were then given a numerical cue that told them which grading to remember, the first grading that was presented or the second. After a retention period, they were presented with a test grading. With the test grading, they had to indicate which way the grading was rotated relative to the original cued grading. fMRI was also used to monitor cortical activity during the task.
They found that activity pooled from areas V1 to V4 were highly predictive of the orientation held in working memory. There was an 83% prediction accuracy. This means that maintaining an orientation is associated with activity in the early visual system such as V1, which is shown by the green line on the graph. To answer the question, yes, the early visual areas seems to reflect contents of the working memory.
The second experiment was the unattended gradings experiment. In this experiment, the participants had to indicate whether a J or a K appeared between rapidly presented letters while ignoring the low contrast oriented gradings that were flashing in the surround. The gradings that were presented to participants were the same gradings from the first experiment. Harrison and Tong then compared the activation by the gradings in this experiment to the activation elicited in the first experiment. Keep in mind that in the experiment 1, the task was to focus on the gradings, while in this experiment, the task was to focus on the letters.
Harrison and Tong asked if thinking or remembering the gradings activated the same areas and systems as actually seeing or attending to the grading. Results from this experiment show that activity that was measured was largely the same for both conditions, which is shown by the black line. In other words, retaining orientation in working memory recruits many of the same areas that are activated when a stimulus is present.
The last experiment was the visual field localizer experiment. This experiment consisted of block presentations of flickering random dots, and participants had to maintain fixation on a central bullseye through every experiment. About 10 working memory runs were completed for every observer, 4 to 5 unattended grading runs, and 2 visual field localizer runs.
Using a decoding analysis on individual fMRI time points, Harrison and Tong were able to determine that orientation selective activity persisted throughout the delay period. This would indicate that V1 likely plays a role in conscious perception, attention selection, and more complex cognitive functions.
So, why is all this research important? Well, based on this research, we now understand that early visual areas can retain specific information about visual features held in working memory. In other words, visual areas are not only important for processing information about the immediate sensory environment, but can also support higher order cognitive functions, as shown in the last experiment. Not only that, but these findings from Harrison and Tong suggest an important source of memory-related information that may have been overlooked in previous studies. As shown with all three experiments, early visual areas sustain information that can extend to the maintenance of visual features and pattern in memory.
While this is a notable study, there are a couple of limitations to keep in mind. First, the sample size consisted of 6 participants, which suggests that this study may have low generalizability and low power. During the second experiment, they found that decoding was significantly impaired by spatial averaging, which means that there may be evidence to suggest global radial bias. What is that, might you ask? Good question. At its most basic level, radial bias is the preference of the visual cortex for some grading orientations over others. Harrison and Tong also found that sustained activity among participants varied widely. For example, they noted that in V1, for half of the participants, there was higher than baseline activity in the late stages of the delay period, while other participants did not have this activity. However, despite this variability, it seems that this did not have major effects on the results of the study, suggesting bold activity may not play a major role in decoding accuracy across subjects.
So where do we go from here? What's next? Based on the current findings from Harrison and Tong, there are lots of notable areas for future research. As mentioned in the article, the synaptic role of the visual cortex would be a potentially beneficial area to research, since the bold response was more strongly associated with synaptic response rather than spiking activity. Other future studies could focus on which mechanisms of working memory information is maintained in, such as long-range interactions or local recurrent activity in the early visual cortex.
Well, that's all we have for you today. Hopefully you've learned something interesting from this video about the contents of visual working memory as they're represented in the early visual areas. Thank you for watching.